And joining us now is the President and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, Yuen Pao Woo. Mr. Woo, it's nice to have you here.
Pleasure.
You've been on the program before, but always by satellite from the West Coast, so we're glad to have you in that chair for the first time.
Nice to be here in person.
Give us the general report card on how China's economy is doing today, in your view.
Well, the world's in recession, as you know, and there is no country that's immune from this economic downturn. China has been hit quite hard because most of China's growth has been coming from the export sector. Even though increasingly exports are going to non-industrialized countries, final demand from industrialized countries, particularly the United States, is extremely important for China. With the collapse in demand in the US and the EU, Chinese exporters are going out of business, quite plainly. So we see growth rates falling from the highs of 10, 12% in the last decade to something like 5, 6, 7%. We see unemployment on the rise. Millions of workers have been laid off, sent back to their villages in the rural areas in the West. So it's hard times for the Chinese, but at the same time, the Chinese government is responding very vigorously. They're putting together some fiscal stimulus and recovery packages. And we are, all told, still going to see growth of something like 6% for this year.
Well, this is what I want to follow up on, because obviously we have negative growth here in the United States and Canada, and people may have a hard time understanding how is it that your economy in China is in such a, I don't mean yours personally, but the Chinese economy is in such bad shape when growth is still 5, 6, 7%. That doesn't compute for some people.
Well, it's all relative, of course, and 6% is a very nice figure for those of us looking at China from the West. But a couple of things to point out here. First of all, China is a poor country. It's a developing country. There are lots of people who are below the poverty line. So a high growth rate is necessary to absorb the poor, to bring them out of poverty into something that's more respectable. And the rule of thumb that the Chinese government and most economists have is 8%. That's the figure, the magic figure, that's enough to absorb the unemployed and the rural poor and to keep the people happy. We don't know if 8% is actually the right number, but it's something like that. So 6% is below the magic figure, and that's worrisome for the Chinese government. But it's still a decent figure, and the Chinese are able to do that because they have internal demand and they have the wherewithal in the government to put fiscal stimulus to build roads, to create social safety nets, and to create demand essentially that replaces the lost demand from exports in the West.
Let me read an excerpt from the Financial Post to you here and then get your view on this. 2 years ago, the Post reports, bankers and policymakers were arguing heatedly over whether New York or London was the world's premier financial center. Once the global recovery begins, however, New York and London might be vying less with one another than with a new competitor in the form of a partnership between Hong Kong and Shanghai. Call it Shang Kong, a highly consequential shift of financial gravity to the east. Do you agree that Shang Kong is about to become the new financial capital of the world?
Well, there's a bit of hyperbole in that there is a shift taking place, no question. And the shift is not just in terms of financial market, it's also an economic weight and inevitably some political weight as well. I'm not ready to say that New York and London are about to be eclipsed as the global financial centers. I think they'll be around for a long time. They'll continue to have a prominent position. But there is no question at the same time that the economic gravity is shifting towards Asia. And when economic gravity shifts in that direction because of manufacturing and production and investment and so on, the financial sector will move as well. Hong Kong is way ahead of Shanghai, so I think to put Shanghai and Hong Kong in the same breath and to talk about Hong Hai or Shang Kong is premature. But there's no question that as these economies, Asia as a whole, as it grows in economic importance, as more investment goes in, as domestic demand becomes more important, financial intermediation will become more important, and they will look to financial centers in Asia rather than just in New York and London.
Here's Min Chin Pei writing in the National Interest. While China may sustain its growth for another 2 to 3 decades and vindicate the optimists, there are equally strong odds that its growth will fizzle. China's economic performance could be undermined by the persistent flaws in its economic institutions and structure that are the result of half-finished and misguided government policies. Do you agree with what he's saying?
Yeah, Pei Ming-sing is a famous pessimist on China, and his thesis, of course, is the unfinished reforms of the Chinese government. He's quite right in the sense that China has made tremendous leaps in progress in terms of economic opening. It's made tremendous progress in terms of information flows and expanding the freedoms of individuals to pursue their economic objectives, but it hasn't put in place the political structures and institutions that will ensure some kind of sustainable, long-run economic growth. But I think the verdict's out. You know, it's not clear that the crisis is going to precipitate some kind of a wrenching change in the political system. If anything, Steve, what we've seen through the crisis and through the last couple of years of a lot of stress in the Chinese system, earthquakes, Tibetan protests, and now the economic downturn, what we've seen, if anything, I think, is perhaps a greater legitimacy for the Chinese government, that is the Communist Party, because the people are looking to the government to give them that sort of stability and leadership and guidance through the difficult times. They are putting their trust in the government. Now, if the government doesn't deliver, there's no question we'll see some rocky times ahead.
In that chair not too long ago was a man by the name of George Friedman, who's the head of Stratfor, the founder of Stratfor,
Yes.
the sort of geopolitical strategic analysis company. And he has a new book out about what he foresees over the next 100 years. Here's what he had to say about China. Roll tape.
The Chinese don't sell their products to the Chinese. The Chinese primarily sell their products overseas. They're hostage to the economic conditions in other countries. So the way I put it, and the United States is the most important of these countries that it sells to. So the United States catches a cold, China catches pneumonia. And people talk about China withdrawing its money from the United States. If the United States were really pushed into a depression by China, China would probably implode.
Do you see it that gravely?
He's got the basic dynamic right. There is a bargain, a grand bargain between China and the US where Americans overspend and the Chinese oblige Americans in the overspending by providing the goods.
But they're not overspending anymore.
They're not overspending anymore, and the Chinese know that. Now, this is a very interesting situation we're in. Now, 10 years ago when there was an Asian economic crisis and China was affected by it, Asia could still grow because there was external demand from the US and from the EU. This time, we've got a global recession. Everybody's down. And the Chinese and other Asian countries, which have been so dependent on exports, realize that the world at the end of the recession is not going to be the same as the world before the recession. The markets of the United States and EU, the US in particular, is going to go into a period of, I would think, sub-potential growth rates. And throughout the region, in Beijing, in Seoul, in Kuala Lumpur, in Bangkok, in Singapore, and Hong Kong, and so on, business leaders and government leaders are thinking about where they can get the growth they need for their populations outside of exporting to the US and the EU.
Do they have an answer?
And they do, and the answer is domestic demand. It's not easy to shift to domestic demand, but all the incentives are there to shift in that direction, because ultimately, stronger domestic demand means a better quality of life. And why wouldn't you want that for your citizens?
Let's follow up with more on the U.S.-Chinese relationship. Here's a piece from Elizabeth Economy and Adam Siegel. Henry Kissinger, they write, has called for the U.S.-Chinese relationship to be, quote, taken to a new level, and Zbigniew Brzezinski has advocated the development of a G2, a group of two comprising China and the United States that could address the international financial crisis, tackle climate change, limit the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and maybe even help resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A G2, has that got legs?
It's very fashionable to talk about G2, and I think one could say fairly that there is a G2 in the making. You're right, many of these issues have to be resolved, global issues have to be resolved by Washington and Beijing speaking to each other. But you know, you'll be surprised to hear that the strongest opposition to a G2 is coming from Beijing itself. Beijing doesn't want to be part of a G2.
Why not?
Well, because China is not a rich country. China has a lot of domestic problems to solve, including some of the challenges you raised around political institutions and domestic stability and so on. So they're not ready to take on the woes of the world. But I think on specific issues, North Korea, for example, there's no question China is a key player there. On regional architecture in Asia, on climate change, there has to be special dialogue between Washington and Beijing. What we know is this: there may not be a G2, and we may not see anything resembling a structured G2 in the years ahead, but the solution to many of the world's problems will run through DC, but they will also run through Beijing.
Do you think the leadership in Beijing has, I don't know, pretensions of trying to be involved in the Middle East conflict and use their good offices to try to help solve that?
Why would they want to get into a quagmire like that? I mean, look, they have economic interests, of course, in many parts of the world, and those economic interests may well encourage them to be involved in some of the more difficult political questions. But no, they're not trying to be Boy Scouts in the world, that's my sense. They want to be responsible players in the global economy and the global political system, but they're not really to take on empire or imperial ambitions in the way that the US, for example, has in the world today.
Another quote from Elizabeth Economy and Adam Siegel. But elevating the bilateral relationship is not the solution. It will raise expectations for a level of partnership that cannot be met. The current lack of U.S.-Chinese cooperation does not stem from a failure on Washington's part to recognize how much China matters. It derives from mismatched interests, values, and capabilities. Do you agree with them?
Well, that's similar to what I said. It's partly that the Chinese don't have that same sense of a need for a G2 because of the values and the priorities issue you mentioned. It's also because they're not ready for it. And a third very important reason is that there are many global problems that will require much more than China and the US working together. Look, just thinking about the problems in Asia, we need Japan to be involved. We need Korea to be involved. We need Southeast Asia to be involved. On real global issues like international financial architecture, the reform of the IMF, the key player there is the EU. The EU is going to have to be willing to give up some of its power in the IMF and the World Bank and other institutions so that there's space for Asian countries. So we need a global solution. And Canada, as a middle power, has a role to play in encouraging a global approach, with Beijing playing a very important role, but not, I think, reducing global problems simply to a G2 formula.
May be the case, though, that these old Cold Warriors really liked a bipolar world. Things were more predictable, maybe simpler, and is that the model that, I don't know, that they think works going forward?
Well, the status quo is always comfortable, even if it isn't an optimal status quo. But you know, the world is changing very rapidly, and the crisis, I think, is precipitating change in a way that even those of us who recognize change may not have anticipated. And so we have to be ready for a world that's going to look very different after the crisis, and that world will have China and Asia as a much bigger part of it.
Let's talk Canada and China. Here's Stephen Harper. I think Canadians want us to promote our trade relations worldwide, and we do that. But I don't think Canadians want us to sell out important Canadian values, our belief in democracy, freedom, human rights. They don't want us to sell that out to the almighty dollar. Now, he said that in November of '06. Here is 2009 now, May of '09. Canadians need to recognize that China, quote, has made progress on human rights. Foreign Affairs Minister Lawrence Cannon said yesterday, a remark that seemed aimed at justifying the Conservative government's recent efforts to improve ties with Beijing. Mr. Cannon said Canada would continue to raise concerns over China's human rights record, but would do so more quietly and as a friend. Do you want to try to rationalize those two statements?
Both are correct.
Both are correct.
Both are correct. The trick, of course, is to have an emphasis, as Mr. Harper says, to not compromise on our values and human rights and democracy, but doing so through friendly relations with China in a way that has a better chance of influencing the Chinese and making a difference. Look, when we do national opinion polls at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, one of the questions we pose to Canadians is whether they believe that the human rights situation in China has improved in the last decade. And fairly consistently, Canadians say yes. A majority of Canadians believe that human rights in China have improved. I think we should take that as a starting point. There is improvement going on. It's not perfect. We should encourage change and improvement, and turning away from the Chinese and hectoring the Chinese is not the way to encourage change.
Well, except that the Harper government believed it was 3 years ago, and now they apparently have changed their tune on that. Why do you think that's taken place?
Well, you'll have to ask them, but I think part of the explanation will have to do with, I think, the recognition of the growing importance of China.
But surely they knew that 3 years ago.
Yes, they did, but perhaps they thought they could have the cake and eat it as well. That you could be, on the one hand, very, very tough on the Chinese and expect that the Chinese would turn a blind eye. I, in fact, think you can be tough on the Chinese, and you can hold to a very strong principled position on values, on human rights and democracy and so on.
Just not publicly and embarrassingly?
No, not, well, certainly that, but beyond that, what the kind of relationship that we need to have with China has to be multifaceted, it has to be multidimensional, it has to be across all fronts. And if we have strong relations across all fronts, people relations, economic, political, social, immigration, and so on, then we can allow certain parts of the relationship to be troubled, to disagree, and yet have the relationship as a whole move forward. That's the key. If you put all your focus on one dimension of the relationship, and that goes sour, as it will inevitably, then the whole thing goes down.
So how does this benefit? Clearly the Harper government appears to be singing a gentler tune on China these days. And I guess we can debate the reasons why that's happened. But what's the payoff for Canada in doing so? Because so far, it doesn't seem like there has been one.
Well, the payoff is better relations means translates into better economic ties. It translates into more trade, two-way trade, both exports and imports. It translates into investment. Look, China is poised to become the world's biggest and most important source of outward investment.
Well, I get all that, but I think it's fair to say that the previous Chrétien government, for example, tried doing all of those things.
Yes, yes.
Team Canada trips, the whole 9 yards,
Yes.
the dog and pony shows.
Yes.
And after it was all said and done, what was the percentage of this country's trade with China? 1%, less than 1%?
Yes.
It didn't seem to have paid off then, doing it that way. The stick approach appears not to have made Canada any more listened to in the corridors
Yes.
of power in Beijing. So what's it all about?
You raise a very good point, and I think the fundamental problem may well be that Canadians aren't prepared, are not ready to take China seriously, to take Asia seriously, and put in the investment in business development, in marketing, in learning the language, in trying to understand the politics of Asia. Look, we are an Asia-Pacific country, but many Canadians don't think that. That's the fundamental problem. And the government has a role to lead. Certainly having friendly relations helps. If you don't have friendly relations, Canadians will feel that it's not important to pay attention to what's going on in Japan or Korea or China. Our education system will not want to put emphasis on learning Mandarin or Japanese or Korean. It's not happening now. But if the government shows some leadership, if our business corporate captains show some leadership, I think Canadians will come along.
Can I just challenge that a bit? You say we're a Asia-Pacific country.
Yes.
You are in British Columbia.
Yes.
There's 20 million people in Ontario and Quebec who I don't think of this as a Asia-Pacific country. Is that the problem?
That's exactly the problem. You're absolutely right. When we do national opinion polling, one of our questions is, do you agree with the statement that Canada is part of the Asia-Pacific region? Only 30% agree. In British Columbia, you're absolutely right, it's 75%. In Ontario, it's well under 30%. Quebec, even lower. That is a big problem. But the fact is we are an Asia-Pacific country. Look, our motto says sea to sea. The other sea is the Pacific Ocean. There's no question about it. If we're not an Asia-Pacific nation, we've got to become one.
Okay. If, another follow-up on this, if our economy is so integrated with the United States' economy, which it is,
Yes.
and the Americans have a pretty good trading relationship with the Chinese,
Yes.
just in terms of obviously a significant percentage of their trade going that way, both ways. Do we really need to have that significant and independent trading relationship with China, given that we kind of can go through the back door with the Americans, can we not?
We can in part, but we may not be able to indefinitely. Look, this is the issue here. Often we say, there are many people who say we don't need to focus on Asia because we've got the US. We are the most important trading partner for the US, and the US is the most important trading partner for us. Well, that's going to change. In fact, it's changed already. China has already overtaken us on the import side, and the day will come probably quite soon when China becomes the most important trading partner for the US and vice versa. So our so-called special relationship, notwithstanding geography, will be undermined, which is why we need to have our own special relationship, our own focus on Asia. And what we see with the Obama administration is a heightened emphasis on Asia, not just economic issues, but political and strategic issues. Where did Hillary Clinton go on her very first overseas visit?
Over to Asia.
To Beijing and to Japan.
Yeah.
And when you looked at her statements over there, this was not the empire, strutting its power. It was about forging a new partnership with Asian countries.
In which case, it's obvious the Americans and the Chinese have got their eye on each other very carefully. In our last minute here, we're a country of 30 million people. We're not a superpower, not a huge player on the world stage. Does China care one whit about this country?
Yes, yes. For historical reasons, Because we are America's neighbor, we do still have a special connection with DC and with Americans. I think China sees Canada potentially as a special friend. The memories about our friendliness towards China through wheat sales, through Bethune, of course, through diplomatic relations, all of that count a lot. We're entering the 40th anniversary of diplomatic relations. Now is the time to revive those good feelings and to capitalize on the relationship.
Mr. Woo, it's good of you to join us at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Pleasure.